I didn't make a single wrong decision that ruined my life. That would have been easier to explain. What I did instead was far more dangerous. I let time decide for me. At first, it felt harmless. Even responsible. When choices felt heavy, I postponed them. When paths felt uncertain, I stayed where I was. I told myself I was being patient, thoughtful, mature. I wasn't running away. I was waiting. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for confidence. Waiting for the moment when choosing would feel safe. That moment never came. Time, however, kept moving. I remember believing that not choosing was a neutral act. That staying still preserved options. That life would remain open as long as I didn't close doors too quickly. I didn't understand then that time closes doors quietly. Not with finality, with neglect. Years passed without dramatic loss. No catastrophe forced my hand. My life remained intact, functional, respectable. From the outside, nothing was wrong. I progressed slowly, steadily, in directions that made sense. Inside, something else was happening. I stopped feeling urgency. Days blurred together, not because they were peaceful, but because they were interchangeable. I woke up, performed my role, went to sleep, and repeated the cycle without resistance. I told myself this was stability. What it really was absence of authorship. I didn't hate my life. I didn't love it either. I existed in a space where everything was tolerable enough not to change. Comfortable enough to stay. Empty enough not to care deeply. That balance was lethal. I became very good at explaining my life instead of experiencing it. I could list achievements, responsibilities, plans. I could justify every choice I had made because none of them were bold enough to be questioned. The problem was not what I chose. The problem was what I never chose at all. I started noticing how often I used phrases like for now and eventually. I treated my life like a waiting room instead of a destination. I believed the real version of my life would begin later, after something shifted, after I became someone else, after fear disappeared. Fear never disappeared. It just became familiar. I learned how to live alongside it without confronting it. I built routines that didn't require courage. I accepted paths that didn't demand presence. I told myself that wanting more was unrealistic, that questioning too much was dangerous. Time rewarded me for that obedience. It gave me continuity. Continuity can look like success when nothing collapses. The first sign something was wrong wasn't sadness. It was distance. I felt removed from my own memories, as if my past belonged to someone else. I remembered events, not emotions. Decisions, not desires. I realized that my life story sounded coherent when told aloud but empty when remembered privately. That realization unsettled me. I tried to ignore it. Ignoring had always worked before, but this time, the thought kept returning in quieter, more persistent ways. What if I'm not choosing because I'm afraid of choosing wrong? What if time isn't waiting for me? What if it's deciding for me instead? Those questions followed me through ordinary days. Through conversations I half listened to. Through plans I agreed to automatically. Through nights where sleep came easily but rest never did. I began to sense a loss I couldn't name. Not loss of opportunity, loss of ownership. I wasn't failing. I was drifting. And drifting feels safe until you realize how far you've gone without meaning to. One evening, I caught myself imagining the future the same way I imagined the past, vaguely, without detail, without emotional investment. That terrified me. Because it meant time had already learned how to move without my input. I had given it permission. I realized then that my greatest regret wouldn't be making the wrong choice. It would be discovering that I never made one at all. That realization didn't lead to action immediately. It led to fear. Fear of how much time had already passed. Fear of what choosing now might expose. Fear that my life had already been shaped by years of silence and postponement. And fear, when unchallenged, is loyal to time. It waits. At some point, waiting stopped feeling passive. It started to feel violent. Not outwardly, nothing in my life suddenly demanded attention. No crisis arrived to justify urgency. The violence was internal, quiet, persistent. It lived in the growing tension between who I was becoming and the life I kept postponing. I began to feel time differently. Not as a sequence of days, but as weight. Each unmade decision added pressure. Each postponed choice tightened something inside me. I felt it in the way my chest stayed tense even when I was resting. In the way silence followed me after conversations that should have felt complete. I wasn't exhausted from doing too much. I was exhausted from not choosing. I tried to reassure myself with logic. I reminded myself that patience is a virtue. That rushing leads to mistakes. That many people live good lives without dramatic passion or clarity. All of that was true. And none of it helped. Because the problem wasn't lack of clarity. It was lack of courage. I started to notice how often I asked the wrong questions. Instead of asking what felt true, I asked what felt safe. Instead of asking what I wanted, I asked what I could defend. My internal dialogue had become a courtroom, not a compass. I was constantly arguing my way out of myself. Fear had become subtle. It no longer shouted warnings. It whispered reason. It told me I was being responsible. That this wasn't the right moment. That I should wait until I was more prepared, more confident, more certain. Fear wore the mask of maturity. And I listened. The cost of that listening became visible in small, unsettling ways. I felt disconnected from my own reactions. Joy arrived muted, disappointment barely registered. Everything felt distant, as if my life were happening one step removed from me. I wasn't unhappy. I was disengaged. That disengagement frightened me more than anxiety ever could. Anxiety implies involvement. Disengagement implies surrender. I realized that by letting time decide for me, I had outsourced responsibility for my own existence. I had allowed momentum to replace intention. Habit to replace desire. I told myself I was being flexible. In reality, I was being absent. The moment that finally pierced the illusion didn't come during a crisis. It came during calm. I was alone, unoccupied, with nothing demanding my attention, and I felt an overwhelming sense of grief. Not for something I had lost. For something I had never lived. I understood then that waiting had become my identity. I was no longer someone preparing to choose. I was someone who lived in preparation indefinitely. Preparation without action is a trap. It feels productive. It feels responsible. It feels safe. But it consumes time just as surely as failure does. I began to see my past as a series of almost moments. Almost choosing differently. Almost speaking honestly. Almost taking a risk. Each almost felt harmless on its own. Together, they formed a life. A life defined by restraint. I imagined myself years in the future, looking back on the present moment, and I felt a wave of regret so sharp it took my breath away. Not regret for what I had done. Regret for what I was still not doing. That future version of me wasn't angry. It was tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of explanations. Tired of being patient with fear. I realized then that time wasn't neutral. It wasn't holding space for me. It was shaping me. Every day I waited, I was becoming someone who waited. Someone who tolerated distance. Someone who survived on good enough. And that version of me would eventually harden. The thought terrified me. Because it meant that if I didn't choose soon, I might lose the capacity to choose at all. That indecision, practiced long enough, becomes character. I had practiced it for years. That was the moment fear shifted. I was no longer afraid of choosing wrong. I was afraid of never choosing. I began to understand that there would never be a moment when the risk disappeared. There would never be a version of me who felt fully prepared to live deliberately. Waiting for that version was another way of disappearing. Time had already taken so much. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But irrevocably. I didn't know yet what I would choose. I only knew that continuing to let time decide was no longer an option. That staying still was, in fact, a decision one I could no longer afford. Because the longer I waited, the less of myself there was left to choose with. The moment I finally chose didn't feel triumphant. It felt exposed. There was no certainty waiting on the other side of my decision. No reassurance that I was doing the right thing, no internal applause for finally waking up. What there was instead was a stark, almost physical awareness: time would not protect me anymore. For years, I had hidden behind waiting. Waiting softened responsibility. Waiting made every outcome hypothetical. As long as I didn't choose, nothing could truly be lost. Choosing changed that. Choosing meant ownership. And ownership is terrifying when you've let time decide for you for too long. I didn't suddenly know what I wanted. That's the lie we tell about turning points, that clarity arrives first and action follows. For me, it was the opposite. Action came before clarity, driven not by confidence, but by refusal. Refusal to keep disappearing. Refusal to keep postponing myself. Refusal to let another year pass without intention. The choice itself was simple, almost underwhelming. I didn't overhaul my entire life overnight. I didn't escape dramatically. I didn't reinvent myself into someone fearless or new. I interrupted the pattern. I stopped agreeing automatically. I stopped planning my future around comfort alone. I stopped treating uncertainty as a reason to freeze. That interruption felt violent to my nervous system. Without waiting as a buffer, everything felt sharper. Time slowed because I was finally inside it. Days carried weight again. Decisions left marks. Even silence felt different, not empty, but deliberate. I felt grief immediately. Grief for the years I had given away quietly. For the chances I had delayed until they expired. For the person I might have been if I had chosen sooner. That grief was unavoidable. And I let it stay. For the first time, I didn't rush to reframe it or soften it or explain it away. I didn't call it learning or growth or everything happens for a reason. I called it loss. Naming it hurt. But it also grounded me. Because loss means something mattered. And for years, I had lived as if nothing mattered enough to risk. I began to see how deeply waiting had shaped me. How cautious I had become. How skilled I was at surviving in half measures. How often I confused being reasonable with being absent. Letting go of that identity was harder than making the choice itself. Waiting had given me a sense of moral safety. It allowed me to believe I was being thoughtful, patient, responsible. Choosing exposed me to criticism from others, yes, but more painfully, from myself. Every doubt resurfaced. What if I chose wrong? What if this was too late? What if I had already missed the life that was meant for me? Those questions didn't disappear. But they lost authority. Because another truth had become louder: not choosing had already cost me too much. I started measuring my life differently. Not by outcomes or achievements, but by presence. By whether I could feel myself inside my own days. By whether my choices required my participation or merely my endurance. Some days, I failed. I slipped back into old habits. I avoided discomfort. I delayed conversations. I wished, briefly, that I could go back to letting time carry me. But I noticed the difference now. Avoidance felt like avoidance. It no longer disguised itself as wisdom. I realized something fundamental during that period: time doesn't just pass. It trains you. It trains you to live with what you tolerate. It trains you to accept what you don't challenge. It trains you to become someone who fits the life you allow. For years, I had trained myself to wait. Now, I was retraining myself to choose. That retraining was slow, uncomfortable, often lonely. Some relationships changed. Some expectations dissolved. Some versions of me were no longer needed. I let them go. Not because it was easy but because keeping them required me to shrink again. I stopped asking whether I could still catch up. That question is poison. It keeps you looking backward, measuring your life against imaginary timelines. Instead, I asked one question each morning: what does showing up look like today? Sometimes the answer was small. Sometimes it was uncomfortable. Sometimes it was simply not hiding. But it was always mine. I didn't get back what time took. That's the part people don't like to hear. There is no refund for waiting. No way to reclaim years spent in postponement. Some doors closed while I stood still. Some versions of my life will never exist. I carry that. But I carry it consciously now. And consciousness changes everything. Because the worst loss isn't lost time. It's living the rest of your life as if you don't own it. If there is a final confession in this story, it's this: I let time decide for me because I was afraid of choosing wrong. And in doing so, I let it take years I will never get back. But I stopped before it took everything. I didn't become fearless. I didn't become certain. I didn't suddenly know who I was supposed to be. I became responsible. Responsible for my presence. Responsible for my direction. Responsible for the life I am still capable of living. Time no longer decides for me. Even when I hesitate. Even when I doubt. Even when I choose imperfectly. Because choosing imperfectly is still choosing. And after a life spent waiting, that is the only real second chance I have left. I intend to use it.